You're asleep. It's 3 in the morning. The house is silent, enveloped in that dense darkness that only exists in the dead of night. And then, a sound. Subtle, almost imperceptible. But someone is there, inside your house. And here's the blood-curdling detail. It's not an ordinary thief looking for valuables. This someone doesn't want your flat-screen TV, doesn't want your laptop, your jewelry, your money. He wants something infinitely worse. He wants you. And you know what the most terrifying part of all this is? This moment isn't random. He rehearsed this scene in his head hundreds, maybe thousands of times. Every step, every movement, every second was calculated with disturbing precision. He knows exactly what he's going to do, how he's going to do it, and why he's going to do it. You're not a victim chosen at random. You're the end point of a plan that began months ago when he saw you for the first time, and something clicked in his twisted mind. Today I'm going to delve with you into the darkest place that exists, the mind of a murderer before, during, and after taking a life. And I'm not talking about the romanticized version that Hollywood loves to sell, not that brilliant psychopath from the movies full of catchphrases. I'm talking about the raw and brutal reality, what really happens in the neurons, in the obsessive thoughts, in the macabre fantasies that repeat themselves until the line between imagining and acting simply disappears. We're going to dissect the psychology behind the homicidal impulse, understand the behavioral patterns that precede violent acts, and most importantly, we're going to identify the warning signs that most people ignore until it's too late. Because here's the truth nobody wants to hear, but everyone needs to know. Predators walk among us every day. They don't look like monsters. They smile. They greet you. Some are even charming. And that's exactly why they're so dangerous. After this video, you'll never look at certain behaviors the same way again. The difference between becoming a victim and a survivor may lie in recognizing the predator's presence at the first signs, before their plan reaches its final stage. So let's start with, this case completely changed how investigators understand the murderous mind. But before that, if you want to continue delving into these real cases and understand how dangerous minds really work, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every week I bring in-depth case analyses that will make you question everything you thought you knew about criminal behavior. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever felt that instinct, that inexplicable shiver near someone who seemed normal? I want to know your story. Now, let's get down to business. Let's dissect the anatomy of a murderer through a case that will show you exactly how this escalation happens in real life. From the first dark thought to the moment when the invisible barrier between fantasy and action finally breaks down. The case I'm about to show you is that of Richard Chase, known as the Vampire of Sacramento. And look, I know the nickname sounds like something out of a B-movie, but the reality behind this man is far more disturbing than any Hollywood script could invent. Chase wasn't the stereotypical serial killer you imagine. Before the crimes, he was just a guy who lived alone, a bit strange, but nothing that would make the neighbors call the police. Some people even thought he was just a troubled young man, someone who needed help. And maybe he did, but what nobody saw was the cauldron boiling inside that head. For weeks before the first murder, Chase was already in a terrifying downward spiral. He spent hours observing houses in the neighborhood. He mentally noted who went out, who stayed, what time the street was emptiest. This wasn't random paranoia. It was a meticulous selection process. He was cataloging opportunities, testing his own courage, feeding a fantasy that grew like a malignant tumor in his mind. And here's the crucial detail that most people don't understand. For him, it made sense. In the distorted logic of his brain, those actions had a purpose. He wasn't simply losing control. He was following an internal script, a delusional narrative where he was simultaneously victim and perpetrator. On January 23, 1978, Chase chose a house, not by chance. The front door was unlocked, and in his mind, that was an invitation, a sign that he could enter. Inside that house was Teresa Wallen, 3 months pregnant, completely unprepared. What happened in the following minutes was an explosion of violence so brutal that even veteran investigators were shocked. But here's what you need to remember. While he carried out each horrific act, his brain was processing it in a completely different way than yours or mine. There was no remorse. There was no inner voice telling him to stop. There was only the consummation of a fantasy he had mentally rehearsed so many times that it had become almost automatic. And that's exactly what we need to dissect now. because understanding what was happening neurologically inside Chase's head at that moment is the key to understanding why cases like this happen, and more importantly, how to recognize the signs before someone reaches that point of no return, is to break this down in a way that makes real sense to you, because murderers aren't crazy in the way popular culture loves to portray them. Most of them know perfectly well what they're doing. The problem isn't a lack of conscience, it's that their brains operate under a completely different logic, a mental architecture where empathy, guilt, and consequences simply don't carry the same weight as they do in your mind or mine. It all starts with fantasy, and I'm not talking about a fleeting thought that crosses your mind and disappears. I'm talking about a mental movie that plays repeatedly, day after day, week after week. In Chase's case, he spent hours imagining violent scenarios, visualizing every detail with cinematic clarity. Each repetition of this fantasy functions as a rehearsal. The brain doesn't perfectly distinguish between vividly imagined experience and real experience. So the more he repeats this mental image, the more familiar it becomes. The psychological barrier that separates thought from action becomes thinner, more transparent, until eventually it disintegrates. It's literally like a neurological addiction. The more he feeds this fantasy, the more his brain demands. Dopamine is released, reward circuits are activated, and then he needs more intensity, more realism, until the fantasy is no longer enough. Alongside this, something even more sinister happens: objectification. The victim ceases to be a person with a name, family, dreams, fears. She is transformed into an object, into a tool, a means to an end. Teresa Wallen was not a pregnant woman with a life ahead of her. In Chase's mind, she was merely the vehicle through which he would satisfy his distorted impulses. This process of dehumanization is absolutely critical because it allows violence to occur without the emotional weight that would normally prevent a person from hurting another. When you remove someone's humanity in your perception, you also remove the moral barriers that protect that person. And this doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, incremental. Each small step of dehumanization makes the next easier. And then comes the trigger, something external that, on the surface, may seem trivial: an argument, a rejection, a moment of perceived humiliation. For most of us, it would just be a bad day. But for someone who has already built this mental structure, who has rehearsed the fantasy 1,000 times, who has already turned people into objects, this trigger is the final permission. It's their brain saying, now is the time. In their distorted logic, the crime not only makes sense, it becomes almost inevitable. It's the logical conclusion of an internal narrative that has been written for months, perhaps years. And when the moment of execution arrives, something fascinating and terrifying happens from a neurological point of view. Some murderers experience an intense, almost sexual euphoria. The heart races, adrenaline floods the system, and they experience a feeling of absolute power that is addictive on the most primal level. Others become completely cold, almost robotic, executing actions with a mechanical precision that seems impossible for someone committing such an extreme act. And then there are those who dissociate completely, as if they were watching themselves from outside their own bodies, a psychological defense where the mind disconnects from the reality of what the hands are doing. But perhaps the most disturbing thing of all is what comes after. Some feel a deep, visceral relief, as if they had finally scratched an itch that had tormented them for months. Others experience a sudden emptiness, a realization that the fantasy promised something that reality did not deliver. And then there are those like Chase, who simply go home, wash off the blood, and start planning the next time, because now the barrier no longer exists. The first crime is always the hardest. The second is already familiar. And from there, it's just an escalation. Now comes the part that really matters to you, because everything I just explained isn't just theoretical knowledge. These are behavioral patterns you can recognize in real life, and recognizing these signs can literally save your life or the life of someone you love. First sign: obsession disguised as interest. If you notice someone showing up in the same places as you with a frequency that seems strange, that's not romantic coincidence. It's tracking. Predators study their prey. They learn your routine, your schedule, the places you frequent when you're alone, and they do it gradually enough so it doesn't seem obvious. But if you pay attention, the pattern is there. That guy you see at the gym on Tuesday mornings is suddenly there every time you go. He shows up at your favorite coffee shop, on your street, at the market. Each isolated appearance can be explained, but the combination of them reveals intention. Second sign, subtle boundary violations. He insists even after you've already said no. He shows up unannounced at your home or workplace. He makes jokes about control, domination, violence, and observes your reaction as if testing how far he can go, because that's exactly what he's doing. Every time you let an invasive behavior slide, he registers it as permission to go further. It's a calculated escalation. Today he ignores a no, tomorrow he ignores your privacy, and eventually he ignores your safety. Third sign, emotional disconnection. He talks about violence, suffering, or tragedies with a coldness that makes you uncomfortable. He tells disturbing stories as if they were funny. He doesn't show genuine empathy when someone is suffering. This isn't just a strange way of being. It's an absence of moral restraint. It's his brain not processing the suffering of others as something meaningful. And fourth sign, progressive isolation. He starts to distance you from your friends, criticize your family, question your relationships. He wants you all to himself. And this is sold as love, as care, as protection, but it's not. It's control. And total control is always the first step towards the worst possible scenario. Now it's crucial to understand that each of these signs in isolation doesn't turn anyone into a murderer. There are controlling people who would never physically hurt anyone. There are people with low empathy who would never commit a crime. But when you see these behaviors combined, when the pattern begins to form, you're looking at a map, and that map shows you where the danger lies there. The question isn't whether you're being paranoid. The question is whether you're paying enough attention, because predators rely on our tendency to rationalize strange behaviors, to give the benefit of the doubt, to not want to seem rude or overreacting. They exploit social politeness as a tool, and while you're trying to be polite, they're taking another step in their plan. Returning to Chase's case, there's a fascinating and disturbing aspect to how killers operate that police still use today to track serial killers. They repeat patterns, always. It's not randomness, it's a behavioral signature. And I'm not just talking about the method of killing, but the entire ritual surrounding the crime, the type of victim they choose, the time of day, the location, the sequence of actions. Chase broke into multiple homes during his short reign of terror in Sacramento, and in each break-in, there were elements that repeated themselves with an almost ritualistic consistency. He always chose houses where he could easily enter. He always attacked during the day. He always performed specific acts of mutilation that made sense within his delusional logic. Why? Because in his distorted mental architecture, that ritual was an integral part of the power he felt. The ritual wasn't just a means to an end. The ritual was the point itself. Removing any part of it would be like taking the taste out of a meal. The satisfaction lay in the exact execution of that pattern he had mentally rehearsed so many times. This explains why serial killers are so rarely able to stop on their own. The first time they cross the line and commit their first murder, they break the most fundamental psychological barrier that exists in human society. The second time validates that they are capable of doing it again. The third time turns the act into routine. And from that point on, they are no longer struggling with the decision to kill or not. They are simply refining the technique, perfecting the method, seeking ways to maximize the satisfaction they get from the act. It's a frighteningly logical progression when you understand the neurology behind it. The human brain is an adaptation machine. It gets used to repeated stimuli. What was shocking becomes familiar. What was enough becomes insufficient. So they need more control over the victim, more time with the body, more risk in the execution because danger adds an extra layer of adrenaline, more violence because the dopamine receptors now require a more intense stimulus to produce the same response. It's literally a self-perpetuating neurological cycle that intensifies with each repetition. Chase killed 6 people in just 1 month before being captured. 6 lives destroyed, families shattered, an entire community terrorized. And with each crime, investigators could see his signature becoming clearer, the pattern solidifying. This wasn't lack of control. It was method. It was a mental operating system completely alien to you and me, but perfectly coherent within his internal logic. And here's the crucial point that connects all of this. This cycle only ends one way. Someone has to stop them. Whether it's the police, a victim who manages to escape and report, or someone close who finally recognizes the signs and acts. because the natural progression, left uninterrupted, is always towards more violence, more frequency, more audacity, until, eventually, they make a mistake that exposes them or escalates so much that they become impossible to ignore. In Chase's case, it was the combination of physical evidence left at the crime scenes and the fact that his paranoid delusions made him increasingly erratic and visible. But how many victims could have been spared if someone had recognized and acted on the warning signs he displayed before it reached this point? That's the question that haunts every case like this. So, what do you actually do with all this knowledge we've just unpacked? How do you transform this understanding of the minds of killers into something practical, something that protects you and the people you love? Let's start with the most fundamental truth. Monsters aren't born with horns. They don't have a distinct appearance that sets them apart from the rest of humanity. They walk the same streets as you, frequent the same places, work in the same offices. Many are even charming, articulate, socially skilled. Ted Bundy was considered attractive and charismatic. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, was a church leader and family man. John Wayne Gacy was a children's party clown. The social mask they wear can be incredibly convincing, but now you know what to look for beneath that mask. You know the signs, the disguised obsession, the violation of boundaries, the emotional disconnection, the progressive isolation. These behaviors leave traces, and when you know how to identify those traces, you gain something incredibly valuable. Time. Time to create distance. Time to seek help. Time to protect yourself before the situation escalates into something irreversible. Second crucial point, trust your gut instinct. That shiver down your spine when you're near someone. That stomach discomfort you can't rationally explain. That persistent feeling that something is wrong even if you can't pinpoint exactly what. This isn't paranoia. It's your primitive brain, the part that evolved over millions of years specifically to detect threats, screaming at you. We live in a society that teaches us to rationalize these instincts, to ignore them because we don't want to seem rude or judgmental. But guess who counts on that? Predators. They know that most people will suppress that warning instinct in favor of being polite, giving the benefit of the doubt, not making a scene. Don't fall into that trap. If something seems wrong, it probably is. And it's infinitely better to be wrong and feel silly afterward than to ignore a legitimate signal and pay with your safety or your life. Third, stop romanticizing red flags. This is perhaps the most common and most dangerous mistake people make, especially in relationships. That guy who is too intense, too fast, too jealous, but you justify it because he's also attentive sometimes. He isolates you from your friends, but says it's because he loves you so much. He ignores your boundaries but compensates with grand gestures. You are normalizing abusive behavior because it comes packaged with good moments. But murderers are also nice sometimes. They can also be kind, generous, affectionate, until they aren't anymore. The pattern of abuse works exactly like this. Cycles of tension, explosion, and honeymoon that keep the victim trapped, always waiting for the good version of the person to reappear. Don't normalize this. Don't accept crumbs of basic decency surrounded by toxic behavior. Chase's case, like countless others we've studied, could have been prevented. There are always signs. Always. Neighbors who noticed strange behavior but didn't report it. Family members who saw mental deterioration but didn't intervene appropriately. Systems that failed to provide proper treatment or supervision. And potential victims who sensed something was wrong but convinced themselves they were exaggerating. The fear of seeming paranoid, of being seen as exaggerating, of creating unnecessary drama. This fear silences people. And in that silence, predators operate freely. Don't make that mistake. Because ultimately, understanding how what killers think isn't about living in fear. It's not about distrusting everyone or locking yourself in your house. It's about empowerment through knowledge. It's about recognizing patterns of dangerous behavior before they escalate. It's about trusting your instincts when they warn you about someone. It's about understanding that predators depend on your silence, your hesitation, your willingness to give them the benefit of the doubt. And when you take those advantages from them, when you are informed and vigilant, you cease to be easy prey. You become someone who recognizes the predator even before it approaches. Look, if you've made it this far, you clearly understand the value of knowing this information in depth. So subscribe to the channel, because every week I bring a new analysis, a different case, always dissecting the psychology behind the most disturbing crimes. And leave the phrase, "knowledge is defense," in the comments. I want to know how many of you made it to the end and are taking this seriously. And if this content made sense to you, if it opened your eyes in any way, leave a like. This helps more people find this type of information that can literally save lives. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic, showing other cases and patterns you need to know. Click and stay with me there, because the more you understand about how dangerous minds work, the more prepared you'll be to protect yourself in this world. See you in the next one.